It doesn't look like we've got anyone on with us yet, so it's okay.
Okay.
We can just wait for them and they can edit out this part. Hey everyone, we're just going to wait about another minute for people to join on in. So you can just enjoy looking at Lori's bountiful harvest that we see on the screen there. All right, well, let's get started. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us for our July Green Living Workshop. My name is Jenny Toffelmeyer, and I'm the Environment and Sustainability Specialist with the town of Okotoks. So I first wish to acknowledge that the land that we are gathering on today in our homes, though virtually, is the traditional territory of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, and the Métis Nation of Alberta in Region 3. So we are going to have an exciting afternoon, I think, learning all about how to preserve all the fruits and veggies that so many of us have been growing this summer. Our presenter today is Lori Neufeld. Now, Lori is a longtime resident of Okotoks and an even longer time avid gardener. So we're really happy to have her here with all of her experience that she brings. Just a quick reminder that everyone attending the webinar today will be entered to win a set of canning supplies. So I will notify the winner over the next couple of days. Now, we will be taking questions throughout the presentation after each slide. And if time allows, at the end of the presentation, I think we'll be good to go there. So if you want to ask a question, there's a Q&A option on your screen, and you can type in any question that you have throughout the presentation. And Lori and I will be doing our best to get through all of them today. So at the end of each slide or two, I'll be jumping in and asking Lori the questions that you have. So before we get started, we are going to do a quick poll because we want to learn more about our audience here. So we want to know, okay, it should be popping up on your screens now. So what method of food preservation are you most familiar with? And I'll share the results once everybody's got their votes in.
Hey, Jenny, I'm not able to click on any of those. It
Oh,
says
I'm sorry.
panelists can't vote, so I imagine others can't either.
I forgot to hit the button that allows you to do that. My bad. All right, looks like we've got 79% of people say freezing is their most preferred way or familiar way that they have preserved food. And then we've got 21% with canning, and no one's done any dehydrating or other. So that's pretty cool. All right, well, Lori, I think we've got a captive audience here this afternoon ready to learn from you. So why don't you share with us all your great knowledge. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. I was really hoping that it would be rainy, but anyways, it's nice to kind of hide in the house in the peak of the afternoon and cool off before we head back out there. Today, I'm going to chat with you about preserving the harvest, and I'm not going to profess to be an expert at this, but I do love to do this, and I do a number of food preservation techniques. I will tell you right off the bat that I don't do any fermentation, so you're not going to learn any of that here. That could be a whole separate webinar Green Living sessions. So what we're going to talk about today is just the techniques that I'm familiar with, and a great way of preserving the fruits and veggies that we grow in the Okotoks area. So as you all, oh boy, how come my computer's frozen? There we go. As you all know, as our gardens grow, we constantly have more and more fresh fruit and vegetables that we're dealing with, and they're so tasty, and we all treasure them as they start to mature, and we have our first crops. But by the second week or third week of eating yellow beans or green beans, most of our kids are kind of terrified of them and tired of them. So one way of extending the harvest is by preserving our veggies to make them last, so that we're not trying to just eat everything at once as they mature. So one of the common ways of preservation is air drying. So I'm not sure, it's similar to dehydration, but not sure how many of you are growing any herbs in pots or in your garden, but one thing that I really love to do is just constantly cut fresh herbs and air dry them. In the past, I've used my laundry room as kind of my dehydrating spot. So I used to cut stalks of dill and all my herbs, and I'd hang them from my drying rack in the laundry room, and that got to annoy my husband. So he ended up building me some of these screens, these wooden screens, and I lay them flat. And then also I've got dehydrators now that I use for drying herbs. But I find the easiest thing to use is either hang drying or just laying flat to dry, and you just leave them on these screens. And then when you're ready to use them in recipes, then just you could test to see whether or not they're dry enough. I wait until they're completely crumbly when you pick up the stalk. If there's any bit of moisture left in there, you don't want to be packaging them up in plastic bags or jars until they're completely dried. Just kind of pause there, and Ginny can let me know if there's any questions that come in.
There aren't from other people, but I have one because I do have a lot of herbs in my garden actually. Do these need to be, do you need to dry them in a sunny spot, or can it be really anywhere as long as it's not damp, I assume?
Yeah, so you want a warm, I would do a darker spot. I know I've dried in my greenhouse before, but I find that the sun, if it's a really bright location, it'll blanch them and they turn them yellow, so they lose their vibrancy and their color. So it's best to use just in a dry, dark place. I have dried in my greenhouse recently, but I'll end up putting like some shade cloth in that just to prevent the direct sunlight from hitting them. Another tip for when you're harvesting your herbs and that is make sure you harvest in the morning when it's cool. You don't want to harvest in the heat of the day, so they're most flavorful when you cut in the morning. And don't wait until they're big plants that have gone to flower or anything like that. So constantly harvest your herbs and just cut as you go. As you cut, it's kind of like deadheading your flowers, and that is you're going to end up with more plants growing, thicker plants.
Awesome. No, that's really helpful. We do have a few more questions. So someone is asking, how long are they good for in a jar after you dry them?
Good question. So, you know, if they're dry, I end up using mine. Like I still have some marjoram and sage that I've harvested from 2 years ago. So I think as long as they're properly dried, they last a long time. They'll lose their flavor if they're stored longer, but generally, if they're properly dried, they can last quite a long time. And it's great just making your own recipe. So usually I grow enough herbs to make my own Italian seasoning, Greek seasoning, and just look off the web for recipes for a different seasoning mix. The other thing, you'll notice my jar of sage here. So I end up drying whole sage leaves, and I don't crumble them until I'm ready to use them in the recipe. So if you pre-crumble stuff, I find it loses its flavor much quicker than just leaving the leaves whole, packing them into a jar, and then when you're ready to use them when you're cooking, that's when you just crumble them with your fingers or with a mortar and pestle.
Cool. Okay. And how long does it take to dry the herbs usually? A couple of weeks, couple of days?
It depends. Like in Okotoks here, we have a pretty dry climate, so it doesn't take that long. If somebody in Vancouver or on the East Coast is trying to dry herbs, you would never be able to. It's just too humid. So This summer it's a bit more humid than typical, and might take longer. So several weeks, at least if you're just doing the air drying method here. If you're using a dehydrator, it doesn't take as long. And so my next slide here is dehydrating. So a lot of people have just the simple round dehydrator, and those are perfect for stacking. I think there's like 6 trays you can stack on top of each other. Those are great for dehydrating herbs. What I have now is the Excalibur dryer, so it's a pretty heavy duty one. It's 9 trays, they're very large trays. The most important thing when you're drying herbs is don't dry them too hot. So if you try to dry in an oven, you might not be able to get that oven temperature low enough and you'll end up with burnt herbs. And same if you're using a dehydrator and want to try to speed up the process and just turn it up higher, you're going to end up burning them. So it's best to dry living food like herbs at a lower temperature.
Awesome.
The other tip too, so what I do is I don't like mixing flavors when I dry. There's some herbs that are more powerful than others. So sage is quite powerful. Marjoram I find is quite powerful as well. So when I do use the dehydrator, I try to just dry one herb of one kind versus mixing.
Now we do have one more question about what kind of herbs do you grow here? What grows best? What kind of variety can we get?
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of luck growing herbs in my garden and having them over winter. So sometimes I'll get an oregano or a thyme to overwinter. So I find my best success is when I grow herbs in pots. And I grow, what do I grow? I grow sage, rosemary, parsley, thyme, oregano, cilantro. I grow pretty much all of them, but I do it all in pots. And I have one herb per pot versus mixing just because there's some that like more moisture than others. And so if you're going to be growing marjoram with oregano, the marjoram needs more moisture than the oregano does. So I tend to find that it grows better when they're just in a pot of their own. And this year, just with all the rain we've been having, I've been just keeping my pots in my greenhouse. But yeah, I find they do best in pots. And feel free to grow anything. The Beaver Dam Nursery here in town is a really good source of herbs in that. I end up starting all of mine from seed usually.
Great, that's all the questions we have for right now.
So dehydrators are also great for fruit. So many of us have apple trees in our yard, or maybe our neighbors or friends have apple trees, and those apple trees are very, very productive. And so this is a typical apple harvest from a friend of ours. We don't actually have any apple trees in our yard, but I have access to my friend's apples. And this is a typical harvest. So we end up harvesting them in my kids' old paper delivery bags, the Western Wheel there you can see. And we end up just spreading them out on our air hockey table in the basement. And they just sit there until I'm ready to process them. So whether I'm doing apple pies or juicing or dehydrating, they kind of sit there and they're in just one spot. So dehydrated apples are another great treat. You can see recipes where they tell you to pre-treat apples with like lemon juice and that, just to prevent browning. We don't do any of that. We just dry them as it is. Use an apple peeler core and then lay them out on the dehydrator sheets and yeah, dry them. You see we have a couple questions.
We do have a couple questions. One goes back to herbs and pots. What kind of fertilizer do you use with your herbs? Anything?
I don't fertilize my herbs at all. So I know a lot of them, they grow in most climates, like in very poor, dry soil. So I would think, well, I would know that they don't require much fertilizer at all, if any. So I don't tend to fertilize herbs.
Okay, good answer. And then we have another one about the apples. So how long do they keep when you spread them out like that? And do they do better in one layer than in a bin?
I find they do better spread out in one layer than in a bin. We start harvesting usually end of August, early September. And by the time I can finally get through all of them, it's probably close to the end of September, early October. So They won't last for months on end, but they just give me enough time to keep them in one spot. And then, like I said, I deal with them when I'm ready to do things with them.
Good. That's all we got.
All right. So another way of preserving your harvest is by freezing. And there's a number of vegetables that are good for freezing, and fruits as well. So rhubarb, tis the season for rhubarb. It's actually the end of it, but a lot of plants are now starting to produce a second crop. Is if you're not ready to deal with rhubarb, or if you're just tired of making rhubarb pies, cut up the rhubarb, freeze it for later. Same with apples. When you have your apples that are ready, you could pre-cut all your apples. I put them in plastic bags and then in a pie plate, and then they're ready for when I need to make an apple pie later on at a later date. Zucchini is also another good one for freezing. We end up often with a bountiful harvest of zucchini. So grate your zucchini, put it in freezer bags. Just make sure you drain it well when you thaw it out and want to use it again. I haven't tried it, but I just read recently that a lot of people will chop up onions and freeze them in usable quantities for recipes and that. So if you're making soups in the winter, you have an onion that's already cut up that you just put in and saute in butter and that before making a soup. So freezing is also a good alternative. Some tips for freezing. So just avoid glass containers in your freezer. So you never want to have glass break in your freezer because it's just a pain in the butt to try to clean out. I find yogurt containers are great for freezing berries. So I know you could buy freezer bags and Ziploc bags. And I used to do that all the time, but now I find just my used yogurt containers are actually better at preventing freezer burn and ice buildup around the berries. So those are always handy. Make sure you dry fruit well before freezing. That keeps the ice crystals from forming, and remove as much air as possible to avoid freezer burn. When you're pulling out frozen fruit to bake, just put it in a colander, shake off the ice, and then you're ready to go. Some other vegetables that are good for freezing, beets are great. So there's only so many beets you can have in the summer months there, but it's always a nice treat to have beets later on in the year. So I always cook my beets, remove the skin, and then either cut up, slice, and freeze, or just leave whole. Peppers, you can leave whole or cut in half, strips or dice. You don't have to do any pre-treatment or anything for peppers or beets. So here's just a typical, this is what I do with my beets actually. I love making beet hummus. That's a nice treat in our house. And so I end up cooking my beets, pureeing them, and then just using freezer containers for storing the right amount of quantity that I need to make my beet hummus at a later date. Another way for freezing vegetables in particular is some vegetables require blanching, and blanching is really stopping the enzymes from reacting and then ultimately destroying the nutrition in the vegetables. And so a lot of vegetables call for blanching beforehand, and this is just a typical blanching pot colander. You have water boiling, you put your vegetables in the colander ones, sit them in the boiling water for a number of minutes, pull out, and then put into an ice bath to cool down. I see we have a question.
Yeah, we do. Someone is wanting your recipe for beet hummus, and I agree. I also conclude that I would also like your beet hummus recipe. Is that something maybe you could send me and I can send out to all our participants?
Definitely, I can do that. Yeah,
Great.
sure. So some blanching tips. Like I said, blanching is necessary to stop enzyme action. There's two types. So you can either do boiling or you can do steaming. So if you had a steamer pot, you could do blanching that way. You just need to increase the recommended blanching time by an extra minute if you're steaming. So when you're done blanching, it's really important that you put those vegetables into ice water just to prevent them from continuing to cook. And here's just some common blanching times for vegetables we grow in our area. Question?
Yeah, oh, we have one more that popped up here. Would you also be sending out notes on your talk? Yeah, actually, we are recording this. So the recording of this video will be posted back onto our website and on the town's YouTube channel by probably Monday afternoon. So you can always grab that and have a look back if you need some notes on what she's talking about.
All right, so there's just some times for blanching. I'll see if we have any more questions on blanching.
Yeah, Jenny's wondering, peas, what happens if you don't blanch prior to freezing them?
You know, I think I've always blanched, so I'm not sure what would actually happen. I think they lose their flavor taste. I don't know if they end up turning mushy or not in the freezer, but it's always best just to blanch beforehand. I think everything, if you use within a short time period, you probably won't notice the taste in that, but.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's all the questions we have for now.
So the other one that a lot of people do is canning. And so there's different types of canning methods. So the boiling water canning method, this is really good for high acid foods. And I'll get into that in the next slide, what a high acid food is. But here's some of the common supplies that you'll need for canning. So there's obviously different size jars and different tools and canners that are available. So the one on the left there is a smaller one. It's perfect for the smaller type jars like the 125 mil, the 250 mils. If you're going anything bigger, you actually can use up to 500 mils. If you're doing anything bigger, the 1 liter jars, you're going to want the larger canner. I know when I started off canning 20 years ago, all I had was the larger one on the right. That was my mom's old canner. And the downside with using a big canner like that for little jars is you're having to heat up a whole bunch of water just for tiny jars that don't need it. So I went and purchased a smaller one just so I didn't have to heat up so much water all the time. Another great thing you can find at Home Hardware, Canadian Tire, is just the Bernardin Home Canning Toolkit. It contains everything that you need for starting out for canning. And my sister got this for me, I think it was the year I had my very first garden 20 years ago, and she got this for me for Christmas that year, and I've been using my same home canning toolkit, and it's really handy. You need snap lids, really important that you buy the type of snap lid for your jar. And the Bernardin lids are really great. I find Safeway in town here has the best price for snap lids. They're usually pretty reasonable there. That's where I purchase mine. And then the lids, or what are they called? I know what they're called. The lids, the metal lids there, those are reusable. Don't ever reuse the snap lids. It's really important that they're only for one-time use only. So some tips for canning, as you're getting ready to can and you pull your jars out of your cupboards, just make sure you check them for any cracks or chips, because the last thing you want is, as they're boiling in the canner, for them to crack and get glass in that water, and then you have to basically start over. Place empty jars on a wire rack in a canner. So all the canners come with a wire rack at the bottom. And it's really important that you never put a glass jar on the bottom of a canner that doesn't have a wire rack. If you somehow lose your wire rack or don't have one, you can always use those screw bands that you saw in the previous slide and put on the bottom of your canner. So just really important, you never have the jars sit directly on the bottom. You need to fill the canner jars with water until they're covered, and then bring to a boil for at least 10 minutes. So you really need to sterilize those jars before you put any of your processed food into them. And then also, by having hot jars, that just helps to ensure that there's going to be no cracks or breakage, because if you try to fill hot material into a cold jar, you could end up cracking the jar. Canning lids, before using them, make sure you soften the seal. So I have a small pot of boiling water, heat it up, and usually about 5 minutes. And again, never reuse those. And always follow recipes for head space. So that's the amount of space that you leave just at between the edge of the rim of the jar and your processed food. You want to try to remove as much air bubbles as possible, and always process according to the recipe. It's really important to note that for Okotoks here, we're at 1,051 meter elevation. And so whatever recipe you see in any cookbook that's calling for boil water canners, add 10 minutes to your processing time, if not more. So it just takes a longer time period being at the elevation that we're at to reach the boiling water point. Once processing is complete, remove the jars from your canner and let rest for 24 hours. Check the seal, so you put your finger in the middle of your jar, and if there's a bubble there, or if it's not sealed tight, it should be vacuum sealed, then it hasn't sealed properly, because usually that seal will happen within that 24-hour time period. You could still eat that stuff, but just make sure you're eating that first and put it in the fridge and eat it within a few weeks. I always store all of my jars of processed food in my basement in a cupboard I have, and I never store with the screw bands on. So store with them off, because that way if they start to go off over time, over the coming months or years or however long you keep your stuff, it's usually good to use your canned stuff within a year. Always just check to see that that seal is still there, because if it's not there, you need to throw it because it's not safe to eat. And I'll stop there.
We don't have any questions from other attendees, but I'm wondering, with the canning lids, what is the danger of reusing them?
So the canning lids, I didn't take a picture of them, but if you have one, you'll notice that there's like a red rubber seal that's on the underside, and that's really to help seal it to the jar. And so once that's been processed once, that seal kind of loses its ability to seal again.
Oh, okay, that's really interesting. Thanks.
So stuff that's tomatoes harvesting. I just have a picture of my tomatoes in my basement there, and as you bring them in, not everything's going to be ripe at once. And so I have all my tomatoes in cardboard boxes usually, and put a few ripe ones in with the unripe ones, and eventually they ripe. But there's so many different recipes you can use tomatoes for. It's just really important. Like I said, I'll get into this in the next slide. There's some foods that canning is good for, and it has to be high acid foods. Tomatoes are on the borderline with acidity, and so you just need to be really careful with any recipes you use that that you look and see that they're acidic enough, and I'll get into that, but usually a tomato recipe will call for a tablespoon of lemon juice or vinegar or something in it, and that just helps to increase the acidity. If you try to can tomatoes on their own, you wouldn't necessarily have that acidity to keep it safe. So high acid versus low acid foods. The reason why you have to pay particular attention to this is your boiling water canner only gets up to a certain temperature. So it's boiling water, so 100 degrees is your typical temperature. More often than not, it's less than that. And that's the temperature at which molds, yeast, and some bacteria are destroyed in high acid foods. Foods that are considered high acid are pretty much all of your fruits, pickles if you're making jams, relish, salsas, chutneys, and tomatoes. Those usually have to have some sort of vinegar or acid added to them, like lemon juice. There's some, like in low acid foods, if you don't have that acidity, you're going to have some bacterial spores that are not destroyed. And so it's really important that if you're trying to can any low acid foods, that you pressure can those. And low acid foods include vegetables, meats, soups, tomato, vegetable sauces, and tomato meat sauces. So if you add any meats or vegetables to your tomato sauce, make sure you use a pressure canner instead of a boiling water canner. And so this is just what a typical pressure canner looks like. I ended up purchasing one a few years ago, and it was right after I had done a brand new kitchen renovation. And I was terrified to use this for about a year after my kitchen renovation, because I thought I was going to end up blowing up the kitchen. But I tend to use this if I add beans to anything, or I'm canning soup stocks in that. But I tend to use my boiling water canner for almost everything else. I'll see if there's any questions.
No questions yet, but where would you buy something like that?
I think I ended up getting this one. Can't remember if I got it at Canadian Tire or not, but Canadian Tire is usually
Okay.
pretty good.
So just local. That's really cool. That's great. Thanks, Lori.
So fruit, this is kind of a typical, I see we have a question. I don't know if that was in relation to
Ah,
Karen.
you're faster than I am. So yeah, with the pressure canner, does it come with directions for how to use it? And what about instant pots?
So I don't have an Instant Pot. So I don't know actually if you can put jars in an Instant Pot. I've never actually looked at one, but yes, the pressure canner itself comes with directions, and I follow it very, very carefully because I am terrified of, like I said, blowing up my kitchen, but I haven't done it yet. I'm not sure. I don't know if anybody else has an Instant Pot that maybe they can put in a chat feature to see if you can actually process food.
Yeah, I
And
guess we'll find out. So if anyone out there has had that experience, let us know in the chat feature.
uh, so fruit is another common thing that we have growing in our yards. The cherries on the left, I don't have a cherry tree in my yard, but my neighbor in the back alley does. And a number of years ago, I think it was probably 7 years ago, I was desperate for cherries, and I asked if we could harvest their cherries, and sure enough, like, they're very generous. They pick what they need. They get their family to come pick what they need, and then every year since then we get kind of the leftovers. And here's just a typical harvest from our neighbor's cherry tree, which I'm very thankful for. And so the cherries usually come at once, and usually you need to deal with them at once, just because when you put them in containers like that, they get pretty soft. And so we end up making tons of pies and tarts, and I'll get into what other things we do with cherries. But other things that we grow around here: rhubarb, apples, Saskatoon berries. I usually go to the Saskatoon farm and pick. Last year I didn't have to. I found a secret spot in Okotoks here, so I collected enough, and I'm not going to tell you where that is, but I collected enough Saskatoons here just close to my home that was able to get me through kind of the year. So what do? You can make pies and tarts. And again, those only store so well. And I find if I pre-make pies and put them in the freezer, they always end up being soggy when I try to bake them again. So what I've found is there's other ways of making the fruit last longer. And so jamming is one method that you can make jams out of the excess fruit that you have. I'll just stop there if we have a question.
Someone was Googling. Thank you, Becky. So Becky says in her Googling, it says that Instant Pots can be used for boiling water canning, but it hasn't been tested for food safety and pressure canning.
Awesome. Thank you for checking that. All right. So jam here. I was telling Ginny that today, because I wasn't out biking or hiking today, I decided to finish off the rhubarb I had in my fridge, and I made some rhubarb jam. It was a citrus ginger rhubarb jam, so easily made this morning. I think I got 7 jars out of that recipe. So jamming is a way of using up your fruit. And so there's different types of sweet spreads. I have just kind of what differentiates them all, because it's really hard to make sense of what they are. I consider them all jam, but they're not all jam. So basically jam is crushed fruit combined with sugar. If you're talking jelly, it's usually a fruit juice with sugar. Marmalade has a citrus peel with the fruit juice, sugar, and other fruits. Conserves is small pieces of whole fruit, usually with nuts and raisins included. Preserves are small fruits in a thick sauce or jelly, and then spreadable fruit is crushed fruit with reduced quantities of sugar. So you'll see different recipes for different things, and that's just a quick snapshot of how they differ. All sweet spreads contain 4 essential ingredients. So you really need the fruit, the pectin, the acid, and the sugar. And there's 2 ways if you're wanting to make jam or jelly. You can use the long boil method or the fruit pectin method. And so the fruit pectin method is where you actually buy a commercial pectin and you add it to your recipe, and that just helps to speed up the process. But pectin is naturally found in all the fruits that we harvest. If you're going to go the long boil method, you need to make sure that you do have some slightly underripe fruits because they contain more pectin. If you're going to just use all overripe, you might not have a good set to your jam or jelly. And so adding that commercial pectin also shortens that cooking time. Any questions?
No, no questions. Thank you.
One of my favorite things that I like to do when I have excess berries, which I do, which you saw the picture of all the cherries and then my apples that I usually have. My favorite thing to do now is juicing. This is kind of the main thing that I end up doing. And this is called a Meulisa juicer. And I got it at Lee Valley a number of years ago. It's made in Finland. It's not cheap, but it's so worth it. If you're able to invest in it, I would highly recommend this appliance for your kitchen. Anyways, the first time I ever used it is the picture on the right. It was at Christmas. I got this for myself for Christmas one year. And I just threw in some apples, a bag of apples, some cranberries, and I made a mulled cider with the steamer juicer. So basically you have a pan of water at the bottom that you put your fruit into the hopper. It's called, that's the middle compartment. Or sorry, that's the juice compartment. That's where the juice collects. The top compartment is your hopper. And that's where you put all your fruit. And so I make all types of juices. So if I have those cherries that I'm done with making pies, I throw the cherries in here and they very quickly juice. And then you use this hose to fill up your hot jars and then can as you normally would. So I usually can for about 20 minutes. And then they're safe jarred juices that I have throughout the year.
Do you get your recipes off the internet for the different types of juices and things that you put in there to spice them up?
I do for the malt. Well, actually, no, I didn't get any recipes off that for the juice. I just added a couple of cinnamon sticks and some cloves in that for the mulled one, but you could easily get recipes off the internet. When I make just apple juice or cherry juice, those are the common types of juices I make. I don't add anything. I would not recommend adding any sugar or anything. Just the juices are sweet enough. The other thing that I use to make juice is rhubarb. So I end up putting stalks into that hopper and that rhubarb turns into a really nice juice. It's slightly bitter, but I love my favorite drink. It's my wine substitute, I call it. I end up drinking sparkling water with my juice, and I put usually maybe a quarter of a cup of juice, and then the rest is sparkling water, and it's sweet enough, and it's such a nice treat
That
all
sounds
throughout the year.
really good. That sounds amazing. We do have one question. Does the juice mix with the water at the bottom of your juice contraption there?
It doesn't. Well, the steam comes through, so yeah, you're going to get some water, but it's pretty much juice concentrate. So that's how the action works. So it's basically a steamer pot, and it steams the fruits. And so yeah, you do have some, but it's not a lot that it would dilute it in any way. And so yeah, it's usually pretty concentrated, powerful stuff.
Nice.
Never
So,
drink it whole.
so do you store the juice in a cool, dark place or a fridge? And how long do you usually keep it around for?
Yeah, so the juice is perfectly safe. It's like a jar of jam. So I store it just in the same basement cupboard, check the seals before use, but it lasts forever. Not necessarily forever, but as long as you would keep your jarred stuff. So I'm still drinking cherry juice that I made last year.
Great. Thanks, Lori.
Yeah, the other thing, I'll talk about it in a bit here, but the pulp that you have left over is great for making fruit leather. And when I do put my apples in here to make apple juice, I end up just cutting the apples. It depends on the size. So if they're smaller apples, I put them in whole. If they're larger, I'll cut them in half. And then just the steaming action, I get the apple juice, and then at the end, I'm left over with pulp. Yes, it has all the stems and seeds in there, but I'll end up using my tomato press. And then I'm left over with applesauce. It really has no sugar added because all the juice has been out. and I make fruit leather out of that applesauce. I don't do that with the cherries because you end up having the cherry seed in there. And so I end up just composting the cherry pulp.
That sounds really tasty.
So what can you do with that juice? Like I said, mix with sparkling water. You can use it in mulled wine. You have that juice, you have the ability to make jelly later. And so there's also recipes. There's this little steamer juicer comes with a recipe book. There's recipes for winemaking. I haven't tried that yet, but you could try that if you had that recipe. And then also fruit syrup. So I often use this at Christmas or Easter if we're having a brunch. I just make different types of fruit syrup out of my juice that I have. So that's kind of the recipe for the juice or for the syrup.
And no questions at this point. So continue on.
All right. So this is what I use for making my fruit leather. So that 9-tray dehydrator that I have is perfect because it's really hard to make fruit leather in the round ones. I know you can buy fruit leather trays or inserts that you can put in, but I find it really difficult to spread around a round surface. So the 9-tray dehydrator that I have is just amazing. I end up lining it with parchment paper. After I've put the pulp through my tomato press to remove all the seeds and skin and stems, I spread it out in a thin layer on the tray here and dry it, and it's awesome fruit leather. My kids love it.
So we do have one question, and it's more regarding the juice. Can you create juice in a pot instead with straining? Do you boil the juice jars afterwards or flip them?
Sorry, what was that? Flip them?
Yeah, flip.
So I'm not sure what's meant by flip, but yeah, so you can make juice without one of those fancy steamer juicers. I never had patience for trying to strain stuff through cheesecloth, and I always found I wasted so much. So I kind of gave up the cheesecloth method, but you could do that, and that's a common way of making jellies, is to use cheesecloth. But I find the steamer juicers so much easier. And then as I'm juicing, I got my boiling water canner going, heating up my jars. And so when the juice is ready, I pour the hot juice into the already sterilized jars and then process them. I'm not sure what's meant by flipping them upside down. Never supposed to store any of your stored or your processed stuff upside down. Always keep it upright.
Okay. Oh, and one more question. I have a great juicer, so Angie does. It's called the Breville juicer. We have juiced entire trees of apples. That sounds awesome.
So
Different options out there, I guess.
there are lots of options. Yeah. So many different ways to process all your fruits in your backyard. Vegetable storage. So after the summer's done and you're digging up your root vegetables, I know a lot of us try to keep our vegetables as long as possible. I find it really hard to store vegetables for a long period of time. In the house that I live in, I don't have a cold storage room like my parents did in our house growing up, or in my first house I had on an acreage in Cold Lake there. The other thing about trying to store vegetables down in this area is we have a really dry climate here. And so if you want to store vegetables, you need to have a very high humid place. So we often don't have that level of humidity here. And if you were going to try to store vegetables properly for any length of time, you need that humidity. And so here's just a simple slide describing what vegetables require what level of cold and humidity. So there are some that require cold and humid. And so by cold, that's 0 to 1 degree Celsius. So beets, cabbage, carrots, parsnips, turnips. There's others that require cold and humid. So potatoes, you can store at a little bit warmer temperature, 5 to 7 degrees. And usually our garages are okay for storing potatoes until probably December, January. And then it just gets too cold for them. There's others that like cool and dry. So winter squash pumpkins like it a little bit warmer and less humid. And then others that like cold and dry. So onions like really cold temperatures, but dry humidity. There's a really good pamphlet brochure. It's not really a brochure. I guess it's a little book. I ended up finding this years ago at the University of Alberta. It was put out by Alberta Agriculture. It's called Home Vegetable Storage. And as I was putting together the slide deck, I was trying to see if this was still available online, if people could still pick it up. And that version's no longer available, but if you were interested in ordering, I have just at the bottom of the slide here where you can order from and the cost of it. So it's pretty low cost, $3 to order this book.
So we do have one question. What is a cured onion?
All right, so I'll get into that. So a cured onion. So for both garlic and onions, it's best to harvest. I'll talk about harvesting. So harvest when the soil is dry. Don't harvest when it's all muddy and wet. Wait till your leaves are kind of more than half, 3/4 turning brown. And that's usually a good time to harvest. So usually in August, later August or mid to late August is a good time for harvesting both onions and garlic. Curing is just allowing them to sit and thoroughly dry before you attempt to store them. And for both garlic and onions, you can either hang upside down in a cool, dark place or lay flat on a raised screen. So I use my greenhouse. I put up the shade cloth there so it's not overly bright and sunny in there. And I end up laying them out on the metal shelving units that I use for growing my plants. And I leave them there for about 3 to 4 weeks. And really important that you don't cut the stems before storing them. Don't try to brush off the dirt or wash them in any way. If you dig them up from the ground, just lay them flat and basically leave them. You can turn them around and see how they're doing every so often, but try to avoid touching them. And you know the curing's complete when the stems are completely brown. So if you have any green left at all, they're not ready to properly store. So if you try to harvest garlic and just cut the stem off and store, it wouldn't last very long. If you follow kind of this technique, you'll end up having garlic for a long period of time. So last year I was able to harvest my garlic and I used my last clove of garlic. I think it was towards the end of May. So it lasted that long. And I didn't have any that rotted or anything like that. Onions I find harder to store for longer periods of time just because even after they're cured, they do like to have really cold temperatures and I just don't have any place where I can get that cold.
That's really cool. So once cured, where do you store your garlic?
So I store my garlic just in my Lazy Susan in my kitchen, and I put just in a brown paper bag, multiple brown paper bags. And so that seems to be the coolest spot in my house. So you don't want to store it anywhere that's warm. You want to find the coolest place to kind of store it that's dark.
Oh, that's really interesting.
All right. So other vegetables of storages you could have, this is all from that book that I was referring to, buried containers, root cellars, basement cold rooms, or refrigerators. I don't think many gardeners in this area, maybe I'm wrong, go out and bury containers of food in their yard. I've never done that one. I've had a basement cold room, and I guess a lot of what I do is either just dehydrating, freezing, or just storing in a refrigerator for as long as I possibly can. It's important to note that vegetables are typically 80 to 90% water. So if your air surrounding your produce is dry, water will evaporate from vegetables. And I know a lot of people will harvest their beets, lay them out on their garage floor thinking that that's good, leaving them for a few days, but then you come back and they're completely shriveled up because they're just dehydrated. So it's best to store a lot of those root vegetables in perforated plastic bags. It allows them to breathe while they retain their moisture. So I find just apple bags, I'll buy apples in the winter and I'll have perforated bags that I end up saving just for storing my beets in the fridge or my carrots in the fridge. When you're harvesting, avoid bruising and wounding your vegetables during harvest. If you end up wounding them in any ways, if you're digging up potatoes, I always seem to stab one with a pitchfork. Eat those first. Don't ever try to store anything that's been damaged because they'll just create rot and spread diseases to the other vegetables. Produce should be clean and free from large clods of dirt. So make sure you dry and try to get off as much dirt as possible. Some of the vegetables like carrots can be washed, but then they must be dried before putting in storage. And if you're going to be storing carrots or beets in your fridge, it's always best to cut off the leafy greens because they draw moisture out of the vegetable.
So we have someone asking, what's the difference between a root cellar and a basement cold room?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think just a basement cold room is, so I think a root cellar, you actually have ventilation into it and you can control the air by just opening up vents to the outside. I think a cold room is just a cold part of your basement that's maybe unfinished in that, but you don't have that same level of control for bringing in air from the outside.
Okay, thank you.
So some useful resources. What I love, these are my two favorite websites, but I'm more of a old-fashioned cookbook person. So these are my cookbooks and they're kind of my go-to books when I want to do any sort of canning or preserving. And I know just starting out, if you buy one of those Bernardin home preserving cookbooks, that'll teach you everything you need to know about canning. So those are very useful. If you don't want to invest in a book, all their recipes and all their techniques and that are available on their website. So I have that listed below. The other one that I really like is, it's called Getty Stewart. And Getty Stewart is a home economist out of Manitoba. And she's got an amazing cookbook called the Prairie Fruit Cookbook. And I also recently purchased a rhubarb cookbook that's a digital version of it. But she also has a blog and an amazing source of recipes. So I encourage you to go to her website. And then Ginny and I were talking beforehand, and Julie Van Roosevelt, she's got great recipes on her website as well for preserving. So some take-home messages: plant vegetables you enjoy eating. Don't let your garden produce and backyard fruit go to waste. So if you're not going to pick your cherries in your trees or your apples in your trees, let friends, neighbors pick and enjoy that harvest. Or if you have and you don't have a friend or a neighbor that's interested, post on a Facebook group page. So in Okotoks here, we have a Okotoks Garden Club Facebook group page. And that's often a spot where people share their excess rhubarb or apples and that. And so in the past, I've gotten cherries from people who posted that they're willing to share the cherries from their tree if you come and pick. Or this year I got a lot of rhubarb from a lady as well. So don't let your stuff go to waste. I know it's great food for the birds and that, but there's a lot of people in town here that would love to be able to use that for doing jamming or juicing and that. Sharing with the food bank as well. It's important to note that the food bank won't take usually canned stuff. So I volunteered in the food bank before, and if you get a jar of canned something, you just don't know if that was properly canned or processed. You don't know how long it's been in there, so often they'll throw that out. But they will take the fresh food and share it with our clients. Follow recipes and processing time to ensure food safety. So never skip out on processing time, never omit certain ingredients, just kind of follow the recipe just to be safe, because if you don't, there are issues. Enjoy your harvest and have fun. And I think that's it.
Thanks so much, Lori. I learned a lot today. This was really great. I'm going to make my husband, since he's the cook in the family, I'm going to make him listen to this later. And we'll see what we can do with all of our stuff from our garden. Oh, we do have one more question. Good. Yeah, if any of you out there have more questions, I'm going to ramble on a little bit about some of the Green Living workshops, but feel free to ask more questions. Oh, good. We've got some more pouring in. So Angie's asking, I blanched carrots last year, and when I cook them from frozen, the texture is strange, softer on the outside and firmer in the middle. Did I do something wrong?
Softer on the outside, firmer in the middle. So I wonder if they just weren't blanched long enough. Yeah, I'm not sure what would cause that? Sorry, I'm just going to go back to my blanching for carrot times. I imagine you followed the time period. So 3 minutes. Yeah, I don't know what would cause that. Sorry.
All good. Oh, someone's saying carrots, maybe not cooled fast enough in the ice afterwards. So that's what Jenny's saying. So maybe,
Okay.
maybe that's something. And Becky is saying, thanks so much. This was awesome. So I'm really glad you're helping everyone out here, Lori. Thank you. This is good. So again, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I loved that presentation. That was wonderful. So if you do think of more questions after we log off the webinar, you can email them to me at sustainability@okotoks.ca and we'll answer them within a few days. If you'd like to rewatch this presentation or recommend it to a friend, we will be posting a recording of this webinar to today's event page on the website. So okotoks.ca/environmental events. And before you all go, I just want to let you know about upcoming events. So tomorrow, some of my Repair Cafe crew and myself are going to be in the park behind the library teaching basic bike tune-up skills, and municipal enforcement is going to be there as well to teach about bike safety. So the first 40 people that show up that don't have a bike bell will get one for free, because bike bells are super safe on the path system. It just makes it safe for everyone who's out there running. And if you know of anyone that this would be of interest to, again, details are online. Next month's Green Living Workshop is going to be pretty cool. So first, Full Circle Adventures will be here to teach us all about how to forage for food in nature. So this one is actually going to be outside. We're going to see people, but we're going to stay physically distant. I think it's going to be great. So she's going to take us out into the river valley, and we're going to see what we can find there. So it's going to be really interesting. This is going to be taking place on August the 19th at 6:30 p.m. and details will be online later this week. So again, huge thanks to Lori. This was such an awesome presentation, and thank you for everyone for attending on this beautiful day. I'm really glad that you're all able to join us. So stay safe, stay healthy, and everyone take care out there. Thanks, Lori.
Thanks.